Enlightenment rumblings notwithstanding, the 18th century, or at least the 18th century up to 1789, was a great age of the aristocracy, and one of the delights of life as an aristocratic young man was taking an extended grand tour of Europe, especially Italy. As these wealthy young Europeans flooded into Italy, they, like all tourists, hunted for souvenirs to bring home. This busy and jumbled painting was commissioned by a young French nobleman who's shown circled in red looking at a guidebook, maybe with some of his traveling buddies. I trust you recognize the works I've circled in blue, yellow, and green. Starting in 1748, the Bourbon Kingdom of Naples began sponsoring excavations of the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The amazing archaeological finds at these sites, in turn, sparked a revival of interest in classical art, architecture, history, and literature, not unlike the classical revival of the Renaissance. This movement came to be known as Neoclassicism. Here's a modern photo. It still gives you a sense of why visitors find these ruins so compelling. Remember Pompeian wall paintings? These were uncovered during the excavations I've just mentioned, and they set off a wave of neoclassical imitation. Here's another Pompeian fresco, which I've set against one of our required neoclassical works, a painting by David. Note the interplay of architectural features and narrative. There was political connection as well. Stay tuned. I'll return to neoclassical painting in just a few minutes, but arguably the most important classical revival came not in painting but in architecture. And no Roman building was more important than our old friend, the Pantheon. But before we get to our Pantheon-inspired required work, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, we need to look at the architect and building that really sparked the neoclassical revival in architecture. It's not a required work, and it's not actually a neoclassical work, but yes, it will be on your unit test. This is Palladio's famous Villa Rotunda. Note the date. We're back in the High Renaissance, and we're back in Venice, or at least the countryside near Venice. Andrea Palladio is considered by many art historians to be the most influential individual in the history of architecture, and this country villa is probably his most famous building, even if it didn't make the list. Palladio's architectural style employed symmetry, mathematical perspective, and many elements of classical temple architecture, including a pediment, an entablature, a dome, and even sculptures on the roof. Go Etruscans. Palladian designs proved especially popular in England and in the American colonies, and then the new Republic of the United States. It's easy enough to see the appeal of this elegance to aristocrats, especially in English aristocracy that didn't tend to go for Baroque with the same enthusiasm as French aristocrats. But why do you think this would appeal in America? Well, the leaders of the new nation, when designing their own homes and even more their new public buildings, sought an architecture that echoed the traditions of the Roman Republic, much admired by our founders, while conveying the seriousness and, we hoped, staying power of the American governmental experiment. So here's the rotunda that Thomas Jefferson designed for the University of Virginia. And here's the U.S. Capitol. Note that, like the Villa Rotunda, it includes a dome rising above a temple facade with a pediment and Corinthian columns. Also like Villa Rotunda, the Capitol was set on a hill overlooking the surrounding countryside. In the case of Washington, D.C., the surrounding malarial river swamp. And finally, our required work of neoclassical architecture, the home of Thomas Jefferson, the home that Thomas Jefferson designed and built for himself on a hill, not like most plantation homes next to a river. Monticello is actually Italian for Little Hill, another shout out to Palladio and to Italy. Jefferson was a self-taught architect, and his main textbook was, as you might have guessed, Palladio's book on architecture. Here's a rough sketch we have of the house he would begin building in 1768. What's missing? There's no dome yet. In 1784, Jefferson left Virginia for Paris, where he served as the new United States minister to France. During that time, he avidly studied European culture. He visited Roman ruins in the south of France. He sent home books, seeds and plants, statues and architectural drawings, and notebooks filled with ideas. When Jefferson returned to the United States in 1789, he embarked on a major remodeling that included a dome-shaped room on the third floor, skylights, and round windows. The house was finally completed in 1809. Building it pretty much bankrupted Jefferson, and when Jefferson died, his daughter was forced to sell the house to pay his debts. Here's the required College Board image of the plan. And here is, I think, a more helpful labeled version. It's in your workbooks. I've stuck the Villa Rotunda plan in the bottom right by way of comparison. Note that Jefferson's building is not designed around a circular room, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. Still, like the Villa Rotunda, Monticello's plan is geometric, rational, and orderly in the neoclassical style. Neoclassical sculpture likewise harkened back to classical times, especially the tradition of the veristic Roman portrait bust, designed to portray its subjects as embodiments of age, wisdom, and public virtue. Do you remember the required Roman work on the upper right? The leading neoclassical portrait sculptor was the Frenchman Jean-Antoine Odone, and it's little surprise that when the Virginia legislature wanted to commission a sculpture of George Washington for their state capital, they turned to Odone. In fact, it was Jefferson who recommended Odone and commissioned the work. The Khan Academy essay covered this work well, but I've noted a few important points on this slide. Fasces got a bad name when Mussolini and then Hitler adopted them as a symbol, but they had long stood for the idea that even thin rods became strong when bound together in unity. An image from ancient Rome and an appropriate image for the new 13 states. George Washington quite consciously modeled himself on the Roman general Cincinnatus, who after winning a victory for the Republic refused to stay on as dictator but instead returned to his farm. I just note that Cincinnatus also opposed efforts to give more political power to plebeians or non-noble Romans, so he wasn't perhaps the ideal democratic model. Still, it's a good story, and it has a fascinating basis in fact. I used to tell my AP government students that one of the most important events in U.S. history was the Newburgh Conspiracy. They stared at me blankly since they hadn't studied this in AP U.S. history, and there's a good reason they hadn't. It's a conspiracy that totally failed. During the unruly days of the Articles of Confederation, a group of Army officers approached George Washington and asked him to accept the role of dictator. Washington refused and instead invited a few leading citizens to a dinner party at his home, where he threw out the suggestion that maybe the U.S. needed a new and better constitution. Washington went on to preside over the Constitutional Convention and, of course, to serve as our first president. Sometimes the most important events of history are events that don't happen. And note, by the way, that this would be great contextual information in an essay. I think we can all agree that Washington was wise to request that Odone sculpt him in contemporary dress, not in classical garb. Congress commissioned this sculpture for the centennial of Washington's birth. It's based on a sculpture of Zeus, and it basically portrays Washington as a buff god. It proved enormously unpopular, which shows that Americans do sometimes display good taste. But you could all identify this as neoclassical as well as truly tasteless, right? It has shown up on a recent AP question. Finally, neoclassical painting. You've already seen this painting, David's Death of Socrates. In my last lecture, I talked about how neoclassical painting reflected the era's fascination with the ancient world. I noted that it also represented a return to emphasis on line over the exuberant color and dynamism of Baroque painters like Rubens. But above all, neoclassical art is famous for its political content, the revolt against the aristocratic excess captured in Baroque art, and the call for a return to Republican civic virtues. In this painting, which is by one of the century's leading women painters, we see the mother of a group of sons who would grow up to lead a democratic revolt against Rome's aristocrats. The painting captures a famous encounter, which would have been very familiar to 18th century classically educated aristocracy and upper middle class who read their Roman history in Latin. Cornelia was the wife of a Roman patrician. She was walking down the street with her children, and they came across a woman who was carrying a jewelry box. She asked Cornelia, "Why aren't you wearing any bling?" Cornelia responded by gesturing to her children. "These are my jewels," she said. Cornelia then told the woman that it was her job to raise her boys to be great men like their father and to serve the Republic. So here we have just the opposite of those bejeweled and adulterous French aristocratic women who ran those Parisian salons. The emphasis on self-sacrifice and civic virtue pervades neoclassical painting. And of course, shades of Rousseau. This was a gal who knew her place, staying at home and hearth. And here we have what is probably the most famous neoclassical painting in our required work, David's Oath of the Horatii. The Horatii are three brothers who have vowed to settle a dispute between the two cities by engaging in combat with three citizens of the rival city. Note the manly, determined brothers being offered swords by their father, and how this contrasts with their weepy mother and sisters. So how does the artist use line to reinforce this message? Again, think about how style and content come together, with context in this case. Well, the men are all straight lines and sharp angles. The women are soft and curved. Remember, these are the folks who kicked women out of the French Academy of Painting. I'm going to let my favorite art history commentator, Simon Schama, talk about this painting and about David. Schama wrote what many consider to be the best historical analysis of the French Revolution, at least in English. And the entire video up on Moodle is an excellent and dramatic introduction to this important event in history. Again, context. So I don't know how much time you have left, but I'm hoping you have time for this 3-minute clip about the start of the French Revolution, also from the Schama video. I'll close here, and in my next lecture, we'll see how this idealism gave birth to bloodshed, then warfare, and with that dark turn of history, we will also enter a new art historical period, Romanticism.